Hey folks, as you can see, I'm still outside. I'm back from my vacation. I've had some delays in terms of moving. I've got everything apart where I used to film, so I'm still doing this out of my backyard. So please forgive the quality, especially the audio. Air conditioners running everywhere as I take you into a typical D&D run. A group of adventurers have made their way through the winding passages and caverns, down vertical shafts and through narrow fissures to the lowest level of the mad wizard Zindros' maze. After using a magic signet ring that they took off the dead hand of the night hag, Fafnir, they opened the huge granite door. As the adventurers moved carefully into the room, its ceiling not exposed by the light of their torches, they came upon a vast pile of coins, gold, platinum, and silver. The dwarf in the group, with his keen eye for treasure, spotted a giant emerald the size of a man's head just at the outer reaches of his dark vision. Hurrying forward to claim his reward, the dwarf imagined what incredible items he might purchase with this fantastic stone. Then, as the dwarf prepared to dig out the emerald from the coins and smaller gemstones which encased it, something unexpected happened. The emerald blinked. For this was no inanimate stone, but the eye of a great dragon, who was now very irritated to have been interrupted in his long sleep. And now all the dwarf could think about was how sad it was that he was about to die. Hello again, folks. KR King here, helping you homebrew your own D&D campaign. So today's episode is on dragons, perhaps the most iconic monster in all of D&D. It is in the title, after all. I'm thinking a series of dragons because I want to talk about them in terms of integrating them into your homebrewed world. And the thing about dragons is, I know there are players who think about like the Beholder or the Mind Flayer as, emblematic of the super evil creature, or something like the Taresk as, a deadly killing machine. But it's not called Dungeons and Mind Flayers. And, dragons aren't in the title of the game merely as an alliterative usage on the word dragons. Because I think the literary and historical lineage of dragons lends it a special place in the pantheon of monsters. And coincidentally, while I was doing some research for this, I discovered that Wizards of the Coast has announced a book dedicated to dragons. It's called Fizban's Treasury of Dragons. It's coming out in October of 2021. No idea what they're going to call it. I've seen a little bit on it. They're going to bring back the old gem dragons, which I think was from the Dragonlance series. So we'll see if this, gives some of the lore ideas that I'm talking about. Obviously, I'm always homebrewing and whatever, but I'm looking forward to seeing that book. Because I think 5e kind of gave short shrift to dragons. Think about some of the supplements where they go into great detail, kobolds or the UNT or, the Battle of the Giths. And aside from the description of the dragons in the Monster Manual, not much. So hopefully this will balance the scales, as it were, towards the dragons a bit more. So this video I'm going to talk about the historical and literary roots of dragons, and also how, these tropes and cultural artifacts influenced Gygax and Arneson and those guys when they created the game of D&D 50 years ago. And so many things in the modern version of dragons was influenced by these early creations. Because the thing is, I think to successfully run dragons in your world, you've got to think about their relationship to the various sentient creatures, humanoid races, back and forth. What do people think about them? What are their numbers in the world? And what relation do they have in terms of the gods or demigods? Because those relations can allow you to, one, create dragons that are level appropriate for your group, but also to have storylines or motivations by dragons where, a super powerful one isn't just going to wipe the party out. All right, if we start with cultural status in terms of what the sentient creatures and humanoids think about dragons in your homebrewed world, it's really helpful to look at the real world, the historical antecedents of dragons, and the literary ones. What's interesting is dragons appear in virtually every society in the history of the world. And whether this is because this combines dragons, the people's natural fear of snakes, with birds of prey or something like that, or there's theories that ancient peoples found fossils of dinosaurs and assumed that dragons once flew. It's clear that even though dragons are a mythical creature, they served a very important purpose to all these ancient cultures, whether to be feared or to be worshipped. So, for example, in China, dragons were considered the top of the hierarchy of monsters and were not considered evil per se at all. Same thing with Japan, Korea. These were considered, the bloodline of monarchs ran through dragons. There are people to this day who consider themselves descended from dragons. And there were many festivals, rituals, and prayers made to dragons which assert control over water, rain, all sorts of things. And the other thing about these dragons was they had powers, speech, and other powers beyond just merely, their breath weapon or their claws or teeth. Whereas if you start in the Middle East, biblical times, you have the Leviathan, which is clearly just an evil creature. You have a dragon in the book of Daniel, which has to be killed as part of end times. And generally speaking, in the West, this tradition of having dragons that are, evil, not so intelligent, they're merely fighting, creatures that have to be destroyed, is followed in the West. Whether it's things like Norse mythology or, St. George killing the dragon. You have a famous picture from England of a red and a white dragon fighting. And generally these dragons don't have strong personalities or intelligence. You could say that the Norse dragon Fafnir does, but in fact this is a dwarf who was given a curse through Loki. It's a very long story, but it isn't a dragon in the sense of just a beast. But the point here with all these historical examples is you have a spectrum historically between dragons that are highly intelligent or have abilities, interact with humans in a non-threatening manner, all the way down to the sort of brute beasts which our hero must go out and destroy by tooth and nail. And I think this is reflected in terms of D&D, in terms of the chromatic dragons, the metallic dragons, the levels of different types of dragons, the age and intelligence and whatnot. Now, another interesting thing about the Norse mythology of dragons is you have the tradition of the hero sneaking into its lair, stealing things. You also have the idea that dragons sleep for long periods of time. Whether this is derived from the fact that reptiles had to hibernate in Norway, I don't know, but Tolkien used these traditions to great effect in his depiction of Smaug in The Hobbit. Which brings us, conveniently enough, to the sort of fantasy depictions of dragons, and Tolkien's is perhaps the most iconic and the one that had the most influence on D&D. And it's clear that the conception of Smaug influenced Gygax and Arneson when they created dragons for their first box set in D&D. Now, we can argue whether the Smaug depicted in The Hobbit is different than the one in Peter Jackson's movie The Hobbit, the most famous film adaptation. But the point is, in both, Smaug is very intelligent, cunning, and he has this power. He has cursed the treasure, which Thorin falls under right up basically until his death. There are other dragon depictions, say in Ursula K. Le Guin's The Earthsea trilogy, in which dragons, they're nasty, but they can be bargained with. They're sort of part of the environment. Or you can even have a very interactive, collaborative relationship with dragons in something like Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern series. The other, perhaps most famous current literary/film depiction of dragons is in Game of Thrones. And these dragons don't have any personality per se, perhaps communicated to Daenerys, but they're certainly not speaking. They don't have spell-like abilities. They basically have their breath weapon, which is unlimited, flying ability, and of course their massive size, jaws and nails. And this sort of mirrors the depiction of dragons in Harry Potter books, the Ukrainian iron bellies, which basically just breathe and blast, but don't really interact. And so once again, like the historical records, you have different depictions of dragons in terms of their intelligence, their interaction with humanoids. You also have a question of numbers. Smaug was considered the last great dragon of Middle-earth. The dragons in Game of Thrones had died off centuries ago until Daenerys gets the 3 eggs and hatches them. Versus the Earthsea trilogy, dragons are part of the world. They're not common, but they definitely have their area. And the Dragon Riders of Pern, they're ubiquitous. And so you can use these examples to decide on the numbers and relationships of the dragons in your homebrewed world. But of course, you're playing a game with rules, and so looking at the stats as they're presented in the books also will give you great ideas in terms of creating this, pantheon culture relationship, how dragons are perceived, how many there are, how much they interact with people. What's important to remember is, in the real world, the historical record of dragons, they are mythological creatures that are used as emblems for, our fears, our desires, trying to ward off events, this sort of thing. In the world of D&D, dragons are real. They interact like real creatures. They have a sense of history, they have an actuality that real creatures do in terms of their environment. And they function as real creatures, with stats, with abilities in the game construct of D&D. So their stats are very important. Again, you can homebrew dragons. I encourage you to come up with your own kind of dragons and whatnot, but look at the stats. These have been play tested in terms of the, challenge rating and this sort of thing. But in terms of this, it's very fascinating to me to see how dragons have evolved over the various versions of D&D in terms of the initial conception, how they've changed in terms of not just the additions and the sort of, meta theory behind them, but in terms of gaming style. So this is the book, The Monsters and Treasure, from the very first box set. And if you look inside here, you will find many of the characteristics of dragons that still hold true today. And you see the familiar division of dragons in terms of chromatic colors, the gradations of intelligence and abilities in terms of both these colors and the ages of the dragons, and a percentage of each color has spell ability. And all of these ideas that Gygax, Arneson, and their gang came up with 50 years ago in Lake Geneva in Gygax's basement are basically part of dragons today in 5th edition. You also had rules that Gygax et al. Took from Tolkien's conception of dragons as from Norse mythology, where you could sneak up on a dragon and there was always a chance they were sleeping. And then you have these rules on subduing a dragon, taking it prisoner, selling the dragon. This stuck through the 1st edition rules. And then you had a 3 times per day breath limit that affected all dragons, even ancient ones, which was definitely not part of the historical view of dragons, but instead was a part of the game design and game mechanics. All right, so then you had this, iconic edition, which I've probably read each page of this book more than any other. So here we had the introduction of the metallic dragons, the aura of fear. As I said, you still had the subdual rules. And here it was explained as an after effect of dragons' innate cowardice, which is something that was never mentioned again in future editions. You also had intelligence breakdowns for various dragons. In those days, they didn't give it a number. It was low, average, high. You had expanded age to 8 at this level. So here is the 2nd edition monster manual. You had more changes here. They got rid of all the subdual rules, and they expanded the age categories to 12. They added the gem dragons, and they talked about dragon hide as being tremendous natural armor that you could use. But here again, not so much on the role of dragons in the world, the history of them or whatnot. This was left up to the GM. Now, the rules cyclopedia, I'm not really going to count in terms of its view there. The dragons are different here, but this was kind of a compendium of the basic edition as opposed to 2nd edition. Now, I ran in this system in a campaign in the 90s for about 10 years. It was fascinating. Maybe at some point, if people are interested, I can go over that, because now they're reprinting these rules. But again, it's better to just move to the 3rd edition, the sort of revolutionary edition of D&D. So here you have the 3rd edition, and as you can imagine, like anything else, dragons became very crunchy, like everything in that very good system. So you had skills, abilities, feats, spell-like abilities. So dragons became very nasty in this 3rd edition, and like a lot of things in this very good system, they became much more complicated to run. You also had families of dragons, a mating pair, and little ones. The little ones would go away fairly quickly, but if you ran into a family of dragons in 3rd edition, that was tough. To try running into a dragon mom. All right, so the 4th edition I barely ran and don't really talk about. So basically we have 5th edition. So as I mentioned, Wizards of the Coast is in October coming out with a book dedicated to dragon lore, which is great because in the 7 years since the 5th edition, and all the supplements and whatnot. They haven't covered that much on dragon lore. A little bit, they talk about each individual dragon in the book, its characteristics and whatnot, but not really their place in the society as such iconic, powerful creatures. And you think about how much they go into like devils and demons and whatnot, and yet not really the same level in terms of their relationships as this iconic creature. And then, of course, you have Dragonborn as a race. It's optional, but most campaigns use it. Well, they don't have much on the relationship of the Dragonborn with their kin. You get their breath weapon of a specific dragon, but, what do the, chromatic dragons think of these Dragonborn? But anyway, back to dragons. Now, again, the 5th edition has taken away some of the complexity of figuring out all the feats and skills and whatnot of 3.5. You don't just have the power cards as in 4th edition. But you do have some you've got legendary abilities, you've got lair abilities, obviously very powerful. Now the breath weapon, each usage has a recharge of a 5 or 6, which you think, well, that's a 1/3 chance. But again, in extended combat with all the abilities of a dragon, they could be breathing quite a few times. Like 4th edition, they've made dragons a solo creature. You run into one at a time. But unlike all the old editions, you're not going to, sneak up on one or find one sleeping in its lair. Now, an interesting thing is they reduce the ages of dragons from 12 down to 5. And I think this is a good idea. I think simple is usually better. And they divide them again with this chromatic, evil, metallic. And they give this Lord Tiamat is the multi-headed, evil chromatic god. And she's constantly at war with the platinum dragon, Bahamut. But basically one paragraph on this in the book. So here again, you have dragons that have been simplified, I think, in a good way from the complexity of 3.5. But again, you don't really have an idea of what their relationship is to the humanoids and sentient creatures, as lords of their universe. They're sort of in their lair and they're greedy and, they're jealous of one another. So in my next video, I'm going to give some ideas on incorporating dragons into your world. I'm going to use, the numbers. How many numbers? Is it the last dragons type concept, only a few? Or are they ubiquitous? They're all around. I'd love to hear from you as a viewer. How do you run dragons? Do you have wandering dragons that just appear? Or is it always in their lair? Are there groups that worship the dragons? Evil humanoids with the chromatic dragons, good with the metallic, that sort of thing. How do they rate in the pantheon of your monsters? Do you prefer to run the beholders and mind flayers and this sort of thing, lich or something as this, ultimate monster, or are dragons truly at the top? But as always, until next time, if you like what you've seen, please subscribe to my channel. Always looking for more. Leave some comments, even if it isn't about dragons, how you've run them in your campaign. I love to hear anything you have to say, and I always answer them. And most importantly, my friends, keep playing D&D and tell somebody else about it. And because it was so crunchy, like a lot of other things, they became, oh my God,